There is a storm making landfall on American soil right now, or rather, there was one on August 31st, 2024, and most of you never heard a single word about it. Super Typhoon Sinlaku drove into the island of Saipan with sustained winds measured at 150 miles per hour and gusts recorded at 184 miles per hour, and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, operating out of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, had been tracking it for days. The National Weather Service office in Tinian, Guam had issued a typhoon warning, not a watch, a warning, the highest classification in their alert system, and more than 170,000 American citizens and residents sat directly in its path. But here is the part nobody is talking about. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS and NBC combined for fewer than 3 confirmed segments on this storm in the 48 hours following landfall. That is not a typo. Fewer than 3 segments for a Category 5 making contact with United States soil. For a storm that put 184 miles per hour gusts through residential neighborhoods, through schools, through the homes of people holding United States passports. Stick with me, because the real story is not the storm. It is what happens to Americans when the country decides, at the editorial level, that they do not count enough to cover. If this has you hooked, hit like and subscribe, because you're going to want to be here when the next named system in the Western Pacific starts tracking toward the Marianas, and we can watch in real time whether the same silence descends again. That is coming. The data says it is coming, and when it does, this channel will be one of the only places covering it before it makes landfall, not after the damage photos start circulating on Reddit 3 days later. Drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know where you're watching from right now, what time it is there, and whether you had heard anything about Sinlaku before this video. Not in a general sense. Specifically, did you see a Chiron? Did a news alert hit your phone? Did a single anchor on a single network say the words Saipan or CNMI in your presence before you clicked on this? Because I have a strong hypothesis about what your answer is going to be, and the comment section is going to confirm it in a way that is going to be uncomfortable to read. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If a Category 5 typhoon with 184 miles per hour gusts, a central pressure of approximately 900 millibars, a confirmed rapid intensification event, and landfall on a US island chain with 170,000 American citizens produced fewer than 3 national television segments in 48 hours, how many storms have to hit before someone changes the editorial policy? How many Americans on the wrong side of the dateline have to shelter in place in the dark before this gets treated as national news? Let me know what you think. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Category 5 that landed on American soil in silence. August 31st, 2024, the Western Pacific. A storm the Joint Typhoon Warning Center classified as a super typhoon was moving northwest across open water toward a chain of islands that belong legally and federally to the United States of America. The National Weather Service office in Tinian, Guam, the NWS field office responsible for tropical weather across Micronesia and the Marianas, had been issuing bulletins. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center had been issuing advisories. The storm was not a surprise. It was tracked. It was measured. It was named. Its name was Sinlaku. At landfall on Saipan, Sinlaku carried sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. That number alone puts a storm at the floor of Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. But Sinlaku was not sitting at the floor. Its gusts reached 184 miles per hour at landfall, a number that clears the Category 5 minimum threshold by 27 miles per hour. This was not a borderline storm. This was not a storm that meteorologists were debating about whether to classify up or down. This was a storm that arrived at full force and spent its energy directly on an American island. Saipan is approximately 12 miles long and 5.5 miles wide. There is no interior. There is no high ground that functionally separates you from the eyewall. There is no driving 3 counties inland to a hotel in a city that is not in the cone. When a storm like Sinlaku passes over Saipan, the entire island is inside the storm. Every structure, every family, every community, shelter. The island does not have a safe side. It does not have a back road out. It has an ocean on every perimeter, and the ocean was not calm. The people in Sinlaku's path were not foreign nationals caught in a geopolitical grey zone. They were Americans, Residents of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands hold United States citizenship by birth, a status conferred since the CNMI entered into its covenant with the United States in 1978. Guam has been a United States territory since 1898. That is 126 years of American jurisdiction. The residents of both Guam and the CNMI pay into federal tax systems, serve in the United States military at rates that consistently exceed the national average per capita, and are represented in Congress by a non-voting delegate in the House. They carry United States passports. They are, by every legal definition available, Americans, and 170,000 of them just took a direct Category 5 hit. Now here is what happened on the continental United States side of that event. Nothing. Functionally, editorially, nothing. The major broadcast and cable networks, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, produced a combined total of fewer than 3 confirmed segments on Sinlaku in the 48 hours following landfall. Researchers tracking network coverage logs have described that figure as effectively 0 for a storm of this magnitude. There was no breaking news Chiron crawling across the bottom of a cable news screen. There was no correspondent in a rain jacket gripping a microphone outside a damaged government building on Saipan. There was no anchor throwing to satellite coverage, no weather team standing in front of a radar loop. No, we are monitoring this situation as it develops. There was no situation, because the situation was not on television. This is not a minor editorial oversight, a Category 5 hurricane making landfall on United States soil, anywhere in the continental US, anywhere in Hawaii, anywhere that the national media has pre-decided counts, triggers an immediate saturating response. The networks go to their weather correspondents. FEMA holds press briefings. The governor of the affected state appears on every Sunday show. The satellite trucks are rolling before the storm is even done spinning. That infrastructure exists. That infrastructure works. It deployed for Hurricane Ian in 2022. It deployed for Hurricane Harvey in 2017. It has deployed consistently and loudly for every significant storm that has struck the lower 48 or Hawaii in living memory. It did not deploy for Sinlaku. There was no satellite truck. There was no Sunday show segment. There was no press briefing with a FEMA administrator walking through a damage assessment map. For the overwhelming majority of the continental United States, August 31, 2024 was an ordinary Saturday. The news cycle was running on whatever it was running on, and 170,000 Americans were sheltering from 184 miles per hour winds, with zero acknowledgement from the national media apparatus that claims to cover American life. I want to be precise about what fewer than 3 segments means in practice, because the number can sound almost abstract until you put it next to something comparable. A moderate Category 1 hurricane threatening the Florida coast will generate conservatively 40 to 60 individual broadcast segments in a 48-hour window before it even makes landfall, before there is confirmed damage, before anyone has lost power, before a single roof has been stripped. The coverage begins at the threat stage. It runs through the overnight. It dominates the morning shows. That is how the system works when the storm is heading toward a place the system has decided matters. Sinlaku was not heading toward that place. Sinlaku was heading toward Saipan. And the system ran fewer than 3 segments after it arrived. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center does not issue its warnings quietly. The JTWC, operating from Pearl Harbor, releases advisory packages that include track forecasts, intensity forecasts, wind radii data, and storm surge estimates. These documents are publicly available. Any newsroom with a meteorologist on staff, and every major network has several, can pull JTWC advisories in real time. The data was not hidden. The storm was not secret. The track was not uncertain. In the days before landfall, the JTWC and the NWS in Tinian were producing a clear, well-documented forecast that placed a Category 5 system on a direct path toward US soil. The newsrooms had the information. The newsrooms made a choice. That choice was not made by one producer at one network on one particular August morning. That choice has been made consistently across 3 decades by the editorial structures of American media, structures that use geography, audience size, and a word, territory, that carries enormous implicit weight in every calculation about where to send a camera crew and how long to run a Chiron. The word territory does enormous quiet work in American media, and the residents of Saipan and Guam have been living inside that quiet work their entire lives. What the silence around Sinlaku reveals is not a failure of journalism logistics. It is not a staffing problem. It is not a bandwidth issue tied to a busy news cycle. It is a revealed, consistent, repeating preference, the editorial version of a policy, even if no policy document exists, that places 170,000 Americans outside the perimeter of the national news event. And the storm did not care about the perimeter. The storm did not adjust its intensity because the cameras were not rolling. The eyewall passed over Saipan at full Category 5 strength regardless of what was or was not appearing on cable news in Atlanta or New York. The wind reached 184 miles per hour in the absence of any correspondent to report it. The damage was real in the absence of any broadcast to confirm it. There was no Chiron. There was no correspondent. There was no breaking news. The storm came anyway. The silence held anyway. And 170,000 Americans spent the first hours after landfall in the dark, in both senses of that word. Part 2. Territory is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. The word appears almost immediately. Every time a major American media outlet does reference Guam or Saipan, which is rare, and in the context of Sinlaku was essentially non-existent, the word territory shows up within the first sentence or two, and it does something that no one in the newsroom has to say out loud. It does not have to be said out loud. That is the point. The word carries a set of editorial assumptions that operate below the level of conscious decision-making, and those assumptions translate almost automatically into a coverage calculus that places 170,000 Americans outside the perimeter of a national news event. The assumption is wrong, not approximately wrong, precisely, legally, historically, federally wrong. Guam became a United States territory in 1898 under the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. That is 126 years of American jurisdiction. 126 years of federal administration, federal courts, federal tax obligations, federal military presence. The United States Naval Station on Guam has operated continuously since 1899. Anderson Air Force Base has been an active military installation since World War II. Guam is not a recent addition to the American administrative map. It has been on that map for longer than Arizona has been a state, for longer than New Mexico has been a state, for longer than Alaska and Hawaii combined have been states. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands entered into its covenant of political union with the United States in 1978. That covenant conferred United States citizenship by birth on all CNMI residents. This is not a grey zone status. This is not a provisional or conditional citizenship. People born in Saipan, in Tinian, in Rota, they are United States citizens at the moment of birth, in the same legal sense that a person born in Columbus, Ohio, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is a United States citizen at the moment of birth. They carry United States passports. They are subject to federal law. They can serve, and they do serve, in the United States military. The per capita military enlistment rate for Guam consistently exceeds the national average, has for decades. The CNMI's rate runs comparably high. These are communities with deep, multi-generational ties to American military service, communities that sent residents to Korea, to Vietnam, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and they are communities that a major Category 5 typhoon just ran directly over while the national news apparatus was elsewhere. And I get it. The language does not help. When a newsroom producer hears the word territory, the mental shortcut that fires is not United States citizen. The shortcut that fires is something closer to not quite the same, something approximately foreign, something adjacent to American, something that belongs in the international desk's queue rather than the domestic desk's queue. The word territory does not mean that to a constitutional lawyer, or to a federal judge, or to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. But in a newsroom at 6 in the morning, when a producer is making a call about whether to pull a weather correspondent off a different story and route satellite truck resources toward coverage of a Pacific storm, the word territory operates like a soft filter. It softens the urgency. It creates just enough ambiguity about the Americanness of the event that the story slides down the rundown. That is the mechanism, not malice, not conspiracy. A linguistic filter applied consistently across 3 decades, producing an outcome that is functionally identical to a deliberate policy of exclusion. Here is what the filter produces in practice. A Category 5 hurricane making landfall in Florida, wind speeds at the Category 5 minimum of 157 miles per hour, which Sinlaku exceeded, generates blanket, preemptive, continuous coverage. The coverage begins at the tropical depression stage. It runs through the named storm stage. By the time the storm is at Category 3, there are correspondents on the ground in the projected impact zone 48 hours before landfall. There are weather team graphics running every 30 minutes. There are crawlers across the bottom of every cable news screen. There are phone alerts pushing to every device in the projected impact zone and, importantly, to every device in the broader national audience, because the algorithm has been told this is a major national story. Sinlaku hit Saipan at 150 miles per hour sustained, 184 miles per hour in gusts, with a central pressure that NOAA historical data places in the top 5% of all recorded Western Pacific tropical cyclones. There was no crawler, there was no correspondent, there were no alerts pushing to devices outside the immediate impact zone. Fewer than 3 segments across 5 major networks in 48 hours. The filter ran. The filter worked exactly as it always works. There is a second layer to this that the word territory obscures, and it concerns congressional representation. Guam has a delegate in the United States House of Representatives, currently a non-voting delegate. The CNMI has a resident representative in the House, also non-voting. These representatives can speak on the House floor, they can serve on committees, they can introduce legislation. What they cannot do is cast a vote on the final passage of any bill. They cannot vote on disaster relief appropriations, they cannot vote on grid hardening infrastructure packages, they cannot vote on FEMA funding levels, the communities most directly affected by the coverage gap and the infrastructure investment gap have zero voting power in the body that controls the federal budget. That is not a parenthetical detail. That is the structural engine that keeps the gap open. When a hurricane makes landfall in Florida, the 2 senators from Florida and the 28 voting members of the House from Florida can make the federal response a voting issue the moment they walk back onto the floor. They can threaten appropriations. They can call press conferences. They can make the political cost of a slow or inadequate response immediately, visibly, electorally real. The CNMI does not have 2 senators. The CNMI does not have any senators. Guam does not have 2 senators. The political accountability mechanism that accelerates federal disaster response for continental states does not exist for these communities, and the national media, which covers federal political accountability as one of its core functions, does not cover the absence of that mechanism in the context of Pacific typhoons. The loop closes on itself. No voting representation means reduced political pressure for adequate response. Reduced political pressure means less news cycle attention on the adequacy of response. Less news cycle attention means less public awareness. Less public awareness means less public pressure. Less public pressure means no change to the editorial filter. And the filter runs again the next time a storm forms in the Philippine Sea and tracks toward the Marianas. It has run at least 3 times in modern memory that are worth naming specifically. Typhoon Omar in 1992, Typhoon Paka in 1997, gusts reaching 236 miles per hour at Andersen Air Force Base, a number that still stands as one of the highest surface wind gust readings ever documented on Earth, and the national news cycle moved past it in under 48 hours. Typhoon Yutu in October 2018, which the Joint Typhoon Warning Center rated as the strongest typhoon ever to make landfall on United States soil at that point in recorded history, and which received a fraction of the coverage that Hurricane Michael, which struck the Florida Panhandle just 9 days later, generated. Michael and Yutu hit within 9 days of each other. Michael killed 16 people directly and caused an estimated $25 billion in damage. Yutu struck Tinian and Saipan with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour and produced damage that the Government Accountability Office would later document as severely straining federal response capacity. The coverage ratio between the 2 storms was not close. It was not even in the same order of magnitude. Michael generated the full infrastructure of American disaster coverage: the satellite trucks, the overnight coverage, the FEMA press briefings, the congressional overflights. Yutu generated in the continental United States an awareness level that most Americans watching this video will be encountering for the first time right now. The word territory ran the filter. The filter held. And 9 days of proximity between 2 Category 5 events on United States soil produced coverage outcomes so divergent that they constitute on their own a data point about editorial priorities. There is a version of this situation where the word territory triggers a more complicated, more accurate mental model, one that accounts for 126 years of American jurisdiction, for birthright citizenship, for per capita military service rates that exceed the national average, for the federal tax and benefit structures that connect these islands to the same government that issues flood insurance in Louisiana and subsidizes grain prices in Iowa. That version exists. It is accurate. It is the legally and historically correct version, but it requires the word territory to carry all of that context into a newsroom at 6 a.m. when a producer has 4 minutes to decide where to point the camera. The word does not carry that context. It never has. And no one in the editorial chain has ever been held accountable for that, because the communities most harmed by the gap are the same communities that the gap renders invisible. What makes Sinlaku a clarifying event is not that it broke new ground. It did not break new ground. What it did was demonstrate in 2024, with 24-hour cable infrastructure and real-time satellite imagery, and a social media apparatus capable of surfacing a story from anywhere on Earth within minutes, that the filter runs just as cleanly as it did in 1992. The technology expanded. The editorial decision did not move. The word territory carried the same weight in 2024 that it carried 32 years ago, and 170,000 Americans sheltered from a Category 5 in the dark while a newsroom in Atlanta made a different call. The filter is not malfunctioning. The filter is working precisely as it was built to work, and that is the problem. Part 3. What a 184 miles per hour wind actually does to a structure. Let's talk about what 184 miles per hour actually means at ground level, not as a number on a map, not as a data point in a Joint Typhoon Warning Center advisory, as a physical event happening to a building where people are sheltering, to a roof over someone's children, to the concrete walls that a family was told would hold. The Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale gives you categories. What it does not give you, unless you read the underlying NWS technical documentation, is the language that sits beneath those categories, the language that describes, with increasing specificity, what the wind is doing to the physical world. That language starts measured and becomes something else entirely by the time you reach the top of the scale. At 74 miles per hour, you're at the lower threshold of tropical storm force winds. The NWS characterization at this level describes damage as minimal. Roof shingles peel, gutters detach, tree branches break. The building frame is largely intact. If you're inside a reasonably constructed wood frame house at 74 miles per hour, you're uncomfortable, you're probably scared, and you will have damage to repair when it is over. But the walls are still standing. The roof is probably still on. You're still inside a structure that is recognizably a structure. At 111 miles per hour, you have crossed into Category 3. The NWS language shifts to devastating damage. That word, devastating, is doing specific technical work here. At this wind speed, well-built wood frame homes lose exterior walls. The roof does not just peel, it leaves. Entire sections of framing can be exposed to the storm's interior pressure dynamics, and once a wall opens, the internal pressure differential accelerates the structural failure. Mobile homes and manufactured housing are described as destroyed. Trees are uprooted at the root ball rather than broken at the trunk. Roads become impassable with debris before the eyewall even arrives. There are no crawl space retreats and no interior rooms that are reliably safe if the exterior shell of the building is compromised. At 130 miles per hour, you are at the Category 4 threshold. Catastrophic damage begins appearing in the NWS documentation. A significant percentage of well-built frame homes sustain severe damage. Total roof failure and wall failure are expected, not exceptional. Power poles are down, power lines are down. Residential neighborhoods in the direct track are expected to be uninhabitable for weeks to months, not days. The distinction between Category 3 and Category 4 is not a 19-mile-per-hour increment on a linear scale. It represents a qualitative shift in what the wind is doing to mass. At 157 miles per hour, you reach Category 5. The NWS language at this level is nearly the same as at Category 4, with one addition that appears almost nowhere else in meteorological documentation. The phrase is catastrophic damage expected. Not likely, not possible, expected. A high percentage of framed homes will be destroyed. Most trees will be snapped or uprooted. Power outages will last weeks to months. The The NWS does not hedge. The NWS says, this is what happens. Now. Sinlaku's gusts reached 184 miles per hour at landfall over Saipan. That is 27 miles per hour above the Category 5 minimum. That gap matters because wind force does not scale linearly with wind speed. It scales with the square of the wind speed. The aerodynamic force exerted on a surface increases by the square of the velocity increase. Going from 157 miles per hour to 184 miles per hour does not add 17% more force. The actual increase in dynamic pressure on a surface is closer to 37% above the Category 5 minimum threshold value. At 184 miles per hour, you're not in a slightly stronger Category 5. You're in a structurally different regime of destructive force. What does that mean for reinforced concrete? This is where the data becomes important in a specific way, because there is a widespread public assumption that reinforced concrete is immune to wind damage at any speed below a direct tornado impact. That assumption is wrong. The ASCE 7 standard, the American Society of Civil Engineers specification for minimum design loads on buildings, calculates design wind pressures based on local wind speed maps. Structures in the CNMI are built to wind design standards, but those standards are calibrated to expected wind return periods, and a 184 miles per hour gust event is at or beyond the design envelope of most existing residential and light commercial construction. Reinforced concrete structures at this wind speed sustain damage to exterior cladding, window systems and connection hardware. Doors blow inward. Glass is not the limiting factor. The frame surrounding the glass becomes the failure point. The storm surge question compounds this. At Category 5 wind speeds over open water, the surge mechanism is no longer functioning the way a tide functions. Storm surge at this intensity does not rise, it advances. The distinction is physical and it matters. A rising tide gives you time, possibly, to move to higher elevation. A surge driven by a 184 miles per hour wind field, advancing across shallow nearshore bathymetry, arrives as a horizontal wall of water, moving at speeds that preclude any response once it is visible. The National Hurricane Center's documentation on extreme surge events describes the phenomenon as unsurvivable in the direct inundation zone without prior evacuation. In the Marianas, prior evacuation does not mean driving to a hotel in the next county. It means leaving the island entirely, and the window for that closes 24 to 36 hours before landfall, when commercial air operations suspend and maritime options become unsafe. Saipan's geography made every one of these problems worse. The island is approximately 12 miles long and 5.5 miles wide. That is not an abstraction. Run the math. You cannot be more than 2.75 miles from the western coastline at the island's widest point. You cannot be more than 6 miles from the northern or southern tip. There is no interior. There is no high ground in the classical sense. The island's highest point, Mount Tapachau, sits at 1,554 feet above sea level. And while that elevation provides some surge protection, it does not provide wind protection. There is no terrain buffer against a typhoon eyewall. The eyewall does not encounter a mountain range that degrades the wind field before it reaches populated areas. The eyewall runs directly over the island. There was no safe side. There was no sheltered quadrant. There was no area of the island where the wind speeds dropped into a range that existing housing stock was reliably designed to withstand. The eyewall's forward edge arrived. The forward edge passed. The eye, a period of relative calm that can deceive people into leaving shelter too soon, passed over. Then the trailing eyewall arrived from the opposite direction with its own full-force wind field. Structures that had been weakened during the forward passage were now being loaded from the reverse direction, and structural failures that had been partial became complete. This is the engineering reality of an eyewall passage on a small island. There is no parallel in continental American storm experience, because continental storms make landfall on a coastline and then weaken over land. Saipan is not land in that sense. Saipan is a 12-mile obstacle in an open ocean. The storm does not significantly weaken crossing it. The storm crosses it, and the island receives the full eyewall from two directions in sequence. The NWS Tian office in Guam, which has operational jurisdiction over the Marianas, issued typhoon warning advisories, the highest tier alert in their classification system, well before landfall. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center's track forecasts were accurate. The intensity forecast captured the storm's Category 5 status. The warning system worked. The warning system issued the highest tier alerts it has, And then the storm arrived at 184 miles per hour and did precisely what 184 miles per hour does. Here is what you need to hold on to from all of this. The Saffir-Simpson scale gives you 5 categories. It gives you clean thresholds and clean labels. What it does not fully communicate, and what the NWS technical documentation communicates only if you read it carefully, is that the scale compresses a physics problem. At 157 miles per hour, damage is catastrophic. At 184 miles per hour, damage is catastrophic and then some, and the and then some is not a rhetorical addition. It is a measured, squared, aerodynamically real addition of force to every surface the wind contacts. There was no category for what Saipan experienced, not because the meteorologists failed to classify it, because the scale tops out at Category 5 and the storm was at the high end of that category. The label stayed the same, the physics did not. 170,000 Americans were in the path of that physics. Most of the continental United States did not know. The NWS issued the warnings. The JTWC tracked the intensity. The instruments did their jobs. And the 184 miles per hour wind did its job too, with the same indifference it brings to every structure in its path, whether that structure is in Miami or Saipan, whether the people inside hold passports or not, whether the story is being covered on cable news or not. The wind does not check the coverage logs. The wind does not care what the rundown says. Part 4. The data confirms this was not a routine storm. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center does not use the word super casually. That designation, super typhoon, is not a media label. It is not a cable news superlative invented to move ratings. It is a formal classification threshold requiring sustained winds of at least 130 knots, which converts to approximately 150 miles per hour on the Saffir-Simpson scale. The JTWC, operating out of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, is the authoritative tracking body for all tropical cyclones in the Western Pacific. When the JTWC applies the super typhoon label, it is because the instrument record meets a specific numerical standard. Sinlaku met it. Sinlaku exceeded it. So let's go through what the data actually showed, piece by piece, because the numbers here are not atmospheric noise. They are a structured argument about what this storm was, and why the silence around it is harder to justify the more closely you look at the record. Start with sea surface temperature, because that is where the storm's energy came from. NOAA buoy arrays and satellite-derived sea surface temperature products, both independent measurement systems cross-referencing each other, documented water temperatures in the waters, Sinlaku crossed running 1.8 to 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above the 30-year average for that region. That range matters. The 30-year average is the baseline against which a NOAA measures anomalies, and 1.8 to 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above that baseline is not a rounding error. In tropical cyclone energetics, the relationship between sea surface temperature and storm intensity is non-linear past a certain threshold. Once water temperatures cross roughly 79 degrees Fahrenheit, and the atmospheric conditions allow a storm circulation to organize, each additional fraction of a degree represents a measurably larger fuel reserve. The waters Sinlaku crossed were not marginally warmer than average. They were running at the high end of what the modern observational record shows for that basin in August. That elevated heat content is the direct physical explanation for what happened next, which was rapid intensification. NOAA defines rapid intensification as a wind speed increase of 35 miles per hour or more within a 24-hour period. That threshold exists because rapid intensification events represent a specific challenge for forecast communication. Storms that intensify that quickly can outpace the public's ability to prepare, and they can outpace the initial model guidance that emergency managers are using to make evacuation decisions. Sinlaku underwent at least one documented rapid intensification event before reaching the Marianas. At least one. The storm did not arrive at Category 5 through a slow, predictable escalation that gave everyone a comfortable timeline. It arrived through a rapid escalation, the kind that compresses the preparation window and puts emergency managers in the position of updating their guidance faster than the public can absorb the updates. Now go to central pressure, because pressure is the number that tells you how powerful a storm actually is, independent of the wind speed measurement, and pressure is harder to misread, harder to round, and less subject to the sampling limitations that affect wind speed estimates. Sinlaku's central pressure dropped to approximately 900 millibars near peak intensity. Write that number down. 900 millibars. For comparison, A typical Category 1 hurricane or typhoon holds a central pressure above 980 millibars. A Category 3 system is generally in the 945 to 964 millibar range. A strong Category 4 approaches 920 millibars. At 900 millibars, you're in the territory of storms that appear in the record books, not as curiosities, but as defining events. The gap between 900 millibars and the Category 1 threshold of 980 millibars is 80 millibars. That gap is not a meteorological abstraction. The pressure gradient between a storm center and its outer circulation is what drives the wind. A lower central pressure means a steeper gradient, and a steeper gradient means faster winds. The math is direct and the physics is not in dispute. An 80 millibar gap between Sinlaku's center and a typical Category 1 storm center is the physical reason why a structure that might survive a weaker storm has no reliable chance in a 900 millibar system. NOAA's historical database places storms with sub-910 millibar pressure readings in the top 5% of all recorded Western Pacific tropical cyclones. The top 5%. The Western Pacific is the most active tropical cyclone basin on Earth. It has been generating tropical storms and typhoons across a recorded observation history stretching back more than a century, with dense instrumental coverage since the satellite era began in the 1960s. The top 5% of that distribution is a small and exclusive club. Sinlaku qualified for membership in that club, while bearing down on 170,000 Americans who held the same passport as everyone watching the evening news on the mainland. There was no ambiguity in the classification. There was no scientific debate about the storm's intensity. There was no hedging in the JTWC advisories about whether this system warranted the super typhoon designation. The instruments agreed. The agencies agreed. The data stream coming off the Argo Float Network, the NOAA buoys, the reconnaissance data, the satellite-derived intensity estimates, all of it pointed in the same direction. I want to be specific about what the Argo Float Network actually is, because it is easy to reference it and move on without understanding what it represents. The Argo program maintains approximately 3,900 autonomous profiling floats distributed across the global ocean. Each float dives to a depth of up to 2,000 meters, drifts for roughly 10 days, and then rises slowly to the surface, collecting temperature and salinity data at multiple depth levels as it ascends. When it reaches the surface, it transmits its data by satellite and then descends again. This network has been operating continuously since the early 2000s, and it provides the subsurface ocean heat content data that matters most for tropical cyclone intensification, because it is not just the top layer of the ocean that fuels a storm, it is the heat stored in the upper 150 to 200 meters of the water column. A storm's wind-driven mixing can cool the surface by churning up colder water from below, but if the warm layer is deep enough, that cooling effect is limited. The Argo data confirm that the warm water Sinlaku was crossing in the days before its approach to the Marianas was not a shallow surface feature. The heat was there at depth. This is not a detail. This is the physical explanation for why the rapid intensification event occurred, why the central pressure dropped as low as it did, and why the storm arrived at the Marianas still at full Category 5 strength, rather than having weakened during its approach. Storms that cross shallow, warm layers can weaken as they churn their own cold water to the surface. Sinlaku did not have that limitation. The fuel was deep and it was dense. The JTWC's track forecast for Sinlaku was accurate. The NWS office in Guam, which has operational jurisdiction over the Marianas, issued the appropriate typhoon warning advisories in advance of landfall. The intensity forecast captured the storm's Category 5 status. These agencies did their jobs. The data systems did their jobs. The Argo floats sent their data. The NOAA buoys sent their readings. The satellites produced imagery. The forecast models ran their ensemble outputs. The entire apparatus of modern atmospheric observation produced a clear, coherent, well-documented picture of what was coming. There was no failure in the observational system. There was no breakdown in the warning chain. There was no moment where the data said one thing and the forecast said another, and an emergency manager had to choose between them. The storm was tracked. The storm was rated. The storm was warned for. And then it arrived, and the data record of what it did matches, with grim fidelity, the data record of what the pre-landfall forecast said it would do. What the data does not record, because data systems do not track editorial decisions, is the inverse relationship between the quality of the meteorological record and the volume of the coverage response. The better the storm was documented, the more precisely the instruments captured its intensity, the more clearly the warning system communicated its danger, and the quieter the national media became. That is not a coincidence that the data can explain. The data explains the atmosphere. It does not explain the newsroom. But here is what the data can do. It can establish, beyond the level of a reasonable dispute, that the decision not to cover this storm was not a judgment call about whether the storm was significant. The storm's significance was not a matter of interpretation. A 900 millibar central pressure is not a matter of interpretation. A rapid intensification event is not a matter of interpretation. A super typhoon designation from the JTWC is not a matter of interpretation. Sea surface temperatures running 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above a 30-year average baseline are not a matter of interpretation. There was no ambiguity. There was no reasonable case for the storm being anything other than what the instrument said it was. Top 5% of all recorded Western Pacific tropical cyclones by central pressure. At least one rapid intensification event. Fueled by anomalously warm water across a deep warm layer. Rated super typhoon by the authoritative Western Pacific Tracking Agency. Making landfall on American soil. Every one of those facts was in the public record before the storm arrived. Every one of those facts was accessible to any producer, any assignment editor, any network meteorologist with a NOAA data subscription, which is to say every major American network. The data was not hidden. The data was not unclear. The data was not late. The data was there, and most of the country was not watching. Part 5. Guam has been here before, and the silence is part of the pattern. The year is 1992. Typhoon Omar makes landfall on Guam with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. The island takes a direct hit. Damage estimates reach $250 million in 1992 dollars, which adjusts to somewhere north of $550 million in 2024 purchasing power. Power infrastructure goes down across the island. Structures collapse. The US territory of Guam, home to Americans, home to a US naval base and an Air Force installation that the Department of Defense considers strategically essential to Pacific operations, sits under a 150-mile-per-hour wind field, and the continental United States largely watches something else. That is not a characterization. That is a coverage log. Then, 1997, Typhoon Paka. This one is different in a specific and measurable way. On December 16th, 1997, instruments at Andersen Air Force Base on Guam recorded a surface wind gust of 236 miles per hour. Read that again slowly. 236 miles per hour. That number sits in the scientific literature not as a regional curiosity, but as one of the highest surface wind gust readings ever documented anywhere on Earth in the modern instrumental record. Not one of the highest in the Western Pacific. Not one of the highest for December storms. One of the highest surface wind measurements recorded by any instrument, anywhere, in the history of modern meteorological observation. The World Meteorological Organization and the National Weather Service both reference it. It is in the data. The national news cycle moved on within 48 hours. There was no extended coverage. There was no moment where an anchor looked into the camera and said, "The highest wind gust ever recorded on American soil was just measured at a US Air Force base, and here is what that means." There was no meteorologist standing in front of a map of the Pacific explaining that the instruments at Andersen recorded something that belonged in a record book. There was no panel of structural engineers discussing what a 236-mile-per-hour gust does to a building, a runway, a fuel depot, a neighborhood. The story appeared, and then it did not. Now we are in 2024, Sinlaku, 150 miles per hour sustained, 184 mile per hour gusts at landfall, a 900 millibar central pressure that the JTWC's own historical database places in the top 5% of all recorded Western Pacific tropical cyclones. Rapid intensification documented. Sea surface temperatures running up to 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above the 30-year average. The National Weather Service office in Tinian, Guam, issued its highest tier alert. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center tracked the system in real time from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the combined coverage from CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS and NBC in the 48 hours following landfall came in at fewer than 3 confirmed segments. That is 3 decades of the same answer. 1992, 1997, 2024. The storm changes. The intensity varies. The record books get consulted for different reasons. The silence holds. Here is what changed between 1997 and 2024. The 24-hour cable news format expanded into wall-to-wall coverage cycles. The internet became the primary news delivery system for most Americans under 50. Social media went from non-existent to a platform ecosystem used by hundreds of millions of people in the United States alone. Satellite imagery became publicly accessible in near real time. The National Hurricane Center and the JTWC began posting online advisories that any journalist with a browser could read. Storm chasing became a genre. Weather as entertainment became a genre. The Weather Channel went from a cable access novelty to a multi-platform media operation. Doppler radar became a household phrase. Every major US network built out a meteorology desk with on-air talent specifically hired to explain atmospheric events in accessible language to a mass audience. The technology expanded, the infrastructure expanded, the editorial will did not move a single degree. That is not an analogy. That is the specific and measurable finding when you compare the coverage environment that existed in 1997 with the coverage environment that exists in 2024, and then compare both of them to the actual output of national media when a Category 5 hit American territory in the Western Pacific. The tools got better, the silence stayed the same. What that tells you is that the silence was never a product of limited tools. It was never a product of bandwidth constraints or satellite access, or the difficulty of getting reporters into the field quickly. Those were never the real variables. The real variable was the decision. And when a decision gets made the same way, consistently, across 3 separate decades, across multiple different media ownership structures, across multiple different network leadership teams, across a span of time that included the emergence of entirely new media platforms, what you're no longer looking at is an oversight. You are looking at a policy. Policies do not require a memo. They do not require a meeting where an executive says, storms hitting Guam will receive minimal coverage. Policies can operate entirely through the accumulation of individual decisions that each follow the same internal logic. The logic here is straightforward. It has been straightforward since Omar. The audience for a storm that hits Saipan or Guam is rated as too small, too geographically distant, and too unfamiliar to the median viewer in the continental United States to justify the airtime. That is the calculation. It runs automatically, below the level of explicit deliberation, every single time. I want to be specific about Paca for a moment, because 236 miles per hour deserves more than a passing mention. For context, the enhanced Fujita scale for tornadoes, which is what meteorologists use to classify the most destructive land-based wind events in the continental United States, tops out at EF5, which requires estimated winds above 200 miles per hour. In practice, most EF5 tornado damage surveys result in estimated winds in the 200 to 210 mile per hour range. The 2013 El Reno tornado, which is the widest tornado ever recorded in US history at 2.6 miles wide, produced winds in the 295 mile per hour range according to Doppler radar measurements, and that storm was covered with an intensity that matched its scale. When wind events in the continental US approach, or exceed 200 miles per hour, the national media covers them as record events, because they are record events. Andersen Air Force Base recorded 236 miles per hour in 1997. That is above the EF5 threshold. That is above the threshold that, in any other context, would have triggered the historic, unprecedented, once-in-a-generation language that American network meteorologists are specifically trained and specifically paid to deliver. On Guam, on American soil, at a US military installation. And the cycle moved on in 48 hours. There is no technical explanation for that. There is no bandwidth explanation. There is no the footage wasn't available explanation in 1997. Andersen Air Force Base has a public affairs office. The Air Force had the instrument data within hours of the measurement. The National Weather Service had it. It was in the record. The record was accessible. The decision was made not to treat it as the record it was. What Sinlaku adds to this history is not just another data point. It is a stress test of whether anything changed. In the years between Paca and Sinlaku, advocates for Pacific territorial communities, journalists based in Guam, researchers studying disaster communication equity, and members of the CNMI's Washington representation all made the same argument, repeatedly, that coverage gaps for Western Pacific storms affecting US territories represented a structural failure in how American media decides whose emergencies count. Those arguments exist in the public record. They were made clearly. They were made with supporting data. They referenced Omar. They referenced Paka. They referenced the pattern. Sinlaku landed in 2024 and demonstrated that the argument had not been answered. There is a specific word that matters here. The word is demonstration. What Sinlaku demonstrates is not simply that coverage is unequal. It demonstrates that the inequality is stable. A stable inequality, one that holds across 32 years, across 3 different media eras, across multiple named storms of record-tier intensity, is not a problem in the process of being addressed. It is a settled condition. Settled conditions do not resolve on their own. They resolve when the external pressure changes, or they do not resolve at all. For the 170,000 Americans on Guam and in the CNMI, the settled condition looks like this. A storm can arrive with the highest surface wind gust ever recorded on US soil, and within 2 days the continental United States has moved on to other programming. A storm can hit with 900 millibar pressure, knock out the power grid, rupture the supply chain, force families into shelters, and produce fewer than 3 national network segments. The pattern produces this outcome predictably, reliably, and without apparent mechanism for self-correction. And the pattern is not slowing down. The Western Pacific does not care about coverage decisions. The warming trend in the Philippine Sea does not negotiate with editorial calendars. The sea surface temperature anomaly that fueled Sinlaku's rapid intensification was not a one-time event manufactured specifically for August 2024. It is part of a multi-decade warming signal that the Japan Meteorological Agency and NOAA have both documented with instrument data going back to the 1980s. The storms are not getting less frequent. The intensity ceiling is not dropping. The Marianas are not moving. What happened in 1992 with Omar set a precedent that nobody had to enforce, because the media ecosystem enforced it automatically through the same internal logic applied over and over across 3 decades. What happened in 1997 with Paka confirmed the precedent and added a data point so extreme, 236 miles per hour at a US Air Force installation, that it should have broken the pattern by sheer force of scale. It did not break it. It confirmed that the pattern was stronger than the data. What happened with Sinlaku in 2024 is the 3rd confirmation, and in science, when the same result appears across independent observations under varying conditions, you stop calling it a coincidence. You call it a finding. The finding is this. The coverage blackout for American Pacific territories hit by major typhoons is not a function of storm intensity, since Paka's 236 mile per hour gust did not move the needle. It is not a function of available technology, since the 2024 media environment is orders of magnitude more capable than 1997's. It is not a function of warning quality, since the NWSTAN office and the JTWC both performed their functions with documented accuracy for Sinlaku. The coverage gap is not explained by any of the variables that would make it excusable. It is explained only by the variable that makes it a choice, the editorial decision about whose geography constitutes a national audience applied consistently across 32 years without revision. That is the pattern, and the pattern is the story. Part 6. The systems that fail when no one is watching. Here is what happens in the 72 hours after a Category 5 makes landfall on the continental United States. FEMA's administrator appears on camera. The president issues a major disaster declaration, sometimes before the storm has fully cleared the coast. The governor of the affected state holds a press conference, often 2, sometimes 3, with damage assessments, shelter counts, utility restoration timelines, and a direct ask for federal resources. Congressional delegations issue statements and begin calling for oversight hearings. The network news programs lead with the storm for a minimum of 2 news cycles, sometimes 5 or 6. Reporters in rain jackets are already on location or en route. FEMA's public-facing dashboard updates in near real time. The system performs publicly, loudly, and with full political accountability, because the people in the path of the storm are represented by senators, and representatives who can vote on the legislation that funds the response. Now here is what happened after Sinlaku made landfall on Saipan on August 31, 2024. No FEMA administrator appeared on a national news program. No press conference ran on the major networks. No Sunday morning show featured a panel walking through damage assessments for the CNMI. The federal response mechanism existed on paper. Disaster declarations have processes, and those processes did run, but they ran outside of public view, without the visibility scaffolding that forces accountability when the affected area has full congressional representation. The CNMI's representative in Washington sits in the House as a resident representative. That representative cannot vote on the House floor. Guam's delegate carries the same non-voting status. When the people most directly exposed to a policy gap cannot vote on the legislation that would close it, the gap does not experience the same gravitational pull toward closure that it would if 2 full Senate seats and a House delegation were on the line. That is not a rhetorical point. That is a structural description of how federal attention gets allocated, and the allocation shows up in the response timelines. The Government Accountability Office documented this exact dynamic after Typhoon Yutu struck the CNMI in October 2018, the strongest typhoon ever to hit US soil at that point, at that time, with sustained winds at landfall of 180 miles per hour. The GAO's findings identified coordination gaps and delays in the federal response that, had they occurred in a state with full congressional representation, would have generated oversight hearings, demanded answers from FEMA leadership on the record, and produced the kind of political pressure that accelerates resource deployment. Instead, the GAO report was filed. Its recommendations sat in a document. And 6 years later, Sinlaku arrived at the same island chain with 150 miles per hour sustained and 184 mile per hour gusts, and the response again operated largely without public visibility. You cannot pressure a system you cannot see. That is the operational consequence of the coverage gap. It is not just that the American public doesn't know about the storm. It is that the absence of coverage removes the accountability mechanism that forces federal agencies to move at the speed that political exposure demands. When CNN is not running a damage assessment Chiron, no senator is getting constituent calls about Saipan. When MSNBC has not cut to a correspondent at the Saipan airport, no House member is holding a floor speech about FEMA response timelines for the CNMI. The coverage and the accountability are not separate systems. They are the same system, and when one goes dark, the other loses its primary pressure source. The power situation on the ground after Sinlaku is where the abstract problem becomes physical. The CNMI's power grid was already operating from a position of structural vulnerability before the storm made landfall. Per capita infrastructure investment in grid hardening for the Marianas runs at roughly 1/3 the comparable figure for Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico's grid funding has been widely and repeatedly criticized as inadequate since Hurricane Maria hit in September 2017. That is the baseline. 1/3 of an amount that experts in infrastructure resilience consider insufficient. When 184 mile per hour gusts move across an island 12 miles long and 5.5 miles wide, the power infrastructure does not survive selectively. Transmission lines come down, substations sustain damage, generation equipment fails. The grid does not go partially dark, it goes dark. Residents posting in the comment sections of coverage that did exist, including posts specifically timestamped to note power down day 3, describe conditions that would have been treated as a national infrastructure emergency if they had occurred in Miami or Houston. There is no neutral way to state that. If a Category 5 hit the Florida Keys and residents were still without power 72 hours later, the phrase, "third day without electricity," would appear in network broadcast segments, in Associated Press dispatches, in White House briefing room questions. The political infrastructure around a state with 2 senators and multiple House representatives would have activated. Governors would be on the phone. The utility restoration timeline would be a nightly news story. On Saipan, on day 3, the power was still out. The story was not running. The supply chain problem compounds what the grid failure starts. The CNMI is not connected to a road network that extends beyond its own coastline. There is no I-95, no interstate bypass, no route that allows a convoy of utility trucks from a neighbouring state to drive in and begin repairs. The islands sit in the Western Pacific, accessible only by air and sea, and when a Category 5 passes directly over the port, infrastructure at Saipan, The port infrastructure at Saipan does not function normally on the morning of September 1st. Ships require inspected berths. Cranes require power. Loading equipment requires operators who are also dealing with the aftermath of 184-mile-per-hour winds hitting the homes they live in. Air corridors reopened faster than sea routes, but the cargo capacity of air freight is not remotely comparable to what a working cargo ship delivers in a single run. You cannot fly in the volume of building materials, fuel, food, and medical supplies that a population of tens of thousands requires in the weeks after a major storm using air freight alone. When port damage stretches resupply timelines, the math is unforgiving. The islands do not carry 30 days of food inventory as a standing buffer. No island population that size does. Supply chains for remote island communities are calibrated around regular shipment cycles, and when those cycles break, the buffer depletes faster than the resupply can arrive. There are no neighbouring counties to absorb displaced residents while repairs proceed. There are no relatives 2 hours up the highway who can take in a family that lost their roof. The ocean is the only exit route and the only resupply corridor, and after a Category 5, that corridor does not cooperate on a convenient schedule. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. Typhoon Yutu in 2018 produced the same resupply bottleneck at the same ports through the same mechanisms, and the GAO documentation of that response explicitly flagged the narrow logistics corridor as a compounding factor in the recovery timeline. The island chain's isolation, which is a fixed geographic fact and not a policy choice, means that every breakdown in the resupply system has a direct human cost that extends for weeks. People eating from emergency stocks, fuel rationing for generators, medical supply chains running thin for patients who depend on regular deliveries of medications that are not manufactured locally. There was no FEMA press briefing walking through those logistics in real time for a national audience. There was no Sunday show panel. There was no graphic on a cable news network showing the distance from the nearest major supply hub to the port of Saipan and the estimated timeline for restoration of normal cargo operations. There was silence, and in the silence, the systems that depend on visibility to function, political accountability, media pressure, public awareness, congressional attention. Those systems ran at a fraction of the output they would have produced for a comparable event in a state with full representation. The 3,900-watt comparison to Puerto Rico deserves more than a quick mention, because Puerto Rico's post-Maria experience became a national story, eventually after enormous criticism of the initial coverage lag, and that story produced real legislative responses. The FEMA reform conversations that followed Maria, the grid investment debates, the scrutiny of response timelines, those all happened because the coverage eventually caught up with the scale of the disaster, even if it caught up late. The CNMI does not have a comparably documented case where the coverage caught up. Omar in 1992 did not produce a national conversation about grid resilience in the Marianas. Paca in 1997 did not produce a national conversation about infrastructure investment per capita in Pacific territories. Yutu in 2018 produced a GAO report that sits in the public record and has not generated the kind of sustained legislative pressure that Puerto Rico's post-Maria story generated. What that means for the grid investment gap is straightforward. 1/3 of an already criticised baseline is the number, because no sustained national pressure has forced it higher. The number reflects the visibility gap directly. You do not have to theorise about the connection between coverage and policy outcomes. The infrastructure investment data quantifies it. Sinlaku passed over a power system built to a standard that the storms of the Western Pacific do not respect. It disrupted port infrastructure with no land-based alternative. It left residents measuring their power outage in days on a grid funded at a fraction of what comparable American populations receive. And it did all of this while fewer than 3 national network segments ran in the 48 hours following landfall. The systems that fail when no one is watching are not metaphorical systems. They are the power lines that stay down because the political pressure to restore them faster never materialized. They are the shipping routes that reopen on a slow timeline because no national spotlight is counting the days. They are the grid-hardening investments that never arrived because the coverage that would have demanded them never ran. The watching is not passive. The watching is the mechanism. Remove it, and the mechanisms that depend on it run slower, fund less, and close gaps that stay open across decades. Part 7. The Western Pacific is warming, and the Marianas sit in the crosshairs. The Western Pacific is not a neutral body of water. It is the most prolific generator of Category 5 tropical cyclones on Earth, and it has held that distinction across every decade of the satellite observation record. That is not a debatable characterization. NOAA's Historical Tropical Cyclone Database and the Japan Meteorological Agency's parallel records both confirm it across multi-decade windows. More Category 5 storms per decade, more rapid intensification events per season, more storms crossing the 150 miles per hour sustained wind threshold than any other basin on the planet. The Atlantic gets the American news coverage. The Western Pacific produces the physics, and sitting directly in the middle of the Western Pacific's most active track corridor, fixed in place, unable to relocate, are Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. This is the context that Sinlaku requires, not the context of a single bad season or a statistical outlier that can be absorbed into the noise, the context of a basin whose thermal energy is rising on a documented, measurable trajectory, and a set of islands that cannot move out of the way. The sea surface temperature data is where this starts, because sea surface temperature is not a background number. It is the fuel system. Tropical cyclones are heat engines. They extract thermal energy from the ocean surface and convert it into rotational wind energy, and the warmer the ocean, the more energy is available for that conversion. NOAA buoy networks and satellite-derived surface temperature records show that sea surface temperatures in the Philippine Sea and the waters immediately east of the Marianas have risen by approximately 0.54 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1980. That is a 44-year trend. That is not interannual variability. That is a directional signal, documented across 4 decades of instrumented observation, running consistently in one direction. Run the arithmetic. 0.54 degrees Fahrenheit per decade across 4.4 decades puts the cumulative warming in that region at roughly 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above the 1980 baseline. For sea surface temperatures, that is not a rounding error. That is operationally significant. Tropical cyclone intensification responds to ocean heat non-linearly, meaning the relationship between temperature gain and storm intensity gain is not a straight line. It is a curve that steepens as baseline temperatures rise. Small temperature gains in cooler water produce modest intensity gains. The same magnitude of temperature gain in already warm water produces disproportionately larger intensity gains because the storm's internal convective dynamics are already primed to extract energy efficiently. The warmer the baseline, the more violently the system responds to each additional degree. Sinlaku crossed water that was running 1.8 to 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit above the 30-year regional average when it underwent rapid intensification before reaching the Marianas. That anomaly is not unprecedented in the historical record, but it is consistent with the warming trend the data shows. This is the distinction that matters. A storm of Sinlaku's intensity crossing water that far above average is not a surprise event in 2024. It is the expected output of the system as it currently operates. The rapid intensification itself deserves its own accounting. NOAA defines rapid intensification as a wind speed increase of 35 miles per hour or more in a 24-hour period. By that definition, Sinlaku underwent a documented rapid intensification event before landfall. The storm went from a severe tropical system to a Category 5 super typhoon on a timeline that compressed the warning window for residents trying to make final preparations. Rapid intensification events in the Western Pacific are not rare, but the frequency of rapid intensification events in the basin is itself trending upward in the peer-reviewed literature, tied directly to the availability of high-enthalpy ocean heat in the upper 50 to 100 meters of the water column. The Argo Float Network, which operates approximately 3,900 autonomous profiling floats across the global ocean and measures subsurface temperature and salinity continuously, shows that the elevated heat content in the Philippine Sea basin is not confined to the surface. It extends downward, meaning a storm that mixes deeper water as it intensifies does not hit a cold thermocline that would act as a brake on intensification. The warm layer is thick. The brake is weak. NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, the modelling centre that produces the peer-reviewed projections used by climate researchers globally, has run the forward scenarios. Under mid-century warming, GFDL's modelling projects that the proportion of Western Pacific typhoons reaching Category 4 or Category 5 intensity will increase by 10 to 20% relative to the current baseline. That is not a projection of more total storms, The total storm count may stay roughly constant or even decrease slightly in some model runs. What increases is the proportion of storms that reach the highest intensity tiers. Fewer storms, more of them are catastrophic when they form. That is the projected trajectory. For Guam and the CNMI, that projection has a specific geographic meaning. The Marianas are not occasionally in the path of Western Pacific typhoons. They sit at a latitude, roughly 13 to 15 degrees north for Guam, 15 to 18 degrees north for the main CNMI islands, that places them squarely in the corridor where Western Pacific typhoons frequently track during the peak season months of August through October. The islands cannot shift their latitude. They cannot move out of the corridor. A 10 to 20% increase in the proportion of storms reaching Category 4 or Category 5 before they cross that corridor means a direct proportional increase in the probability that any given season produces a Sinlaku class event for those islands. There is also the question of translation speed. There is emerging research, peer-reviewed, appearing in journals including Nature and the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, indicating that the forward translation speed of tropical cyclones may be slowing in some regions as the planetary temperature gradient between the tropics and the poles decreases. A slower moving storm sits over any given location for longer. It delivers more total wind energy. It pushes more storm surge. It drops more rainfall. A Sinlaku-class storm moving at 80% of its historical average translation speed would expose Saipan to peak eyewall winds for a measurably longer duration than the same storm moving at historical speed. The 12-mile-long island had no refuge to begin with. A slower storm makes the absence of refuge worse by the mathematics of duration alone. None of this is speculative framing built around a single event. The 1992 data point is Omar at 150 miles per hour sustained, $250 million in damage, almost no continental US coverage. The 1997 data point is Parker, with gusts recorded at 236 miles per hour at Andersen Air Force Base, a measurement that still sits in the global record books as one of the highest surface wind gust readings ever documented anywhere on Earth. The 2018 data point is Yutu, the strongest typhoon to make landfall on US soil at that time, at 180 miles per hour sustained. And the 2024 data point is Sinlaku, at 150 miles per hour sustained and 184 mile per hour gusts, reaching a central pressure of approximately 900 millibars near peak intensity. There is a number sequence embedded in that list: 1992, 1997, 2018, 2024. Major typhoon impacts on US Pacific territories, separated by gaps of 5, 21, and 6 years respectively. The gaps are not widening. The GFDL projections suggest the gaps are more likely to narrow than to expand as the proportion of high-intensity storms increases. What Sinlaku was is not ambiguous. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center, operating out of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, classified it at peak as a Category 5 super typhoon. The JTWC's own scale requires 130 knots, roughly 150 miles per hour, for that classification. Sinlaku cleared that threshold. Its pressure of approximately 900 millibars placed it in the top 5% of all recorded Western Pacific tropical cyclones by intensity, according to NOAA's historical database. Storms with sub-910 millibar central pressure readings are not routine. They are the tail of the distribution. They are what the basin produces at its most energetically extreme, and the basin produced one, at full force, directly over US territory in August 2024. The argument that this is a freak event, an outlier that proves nothing about the future, does not survive contact with the data. The sea surface temperature trend is 44 years old and running. The GFDL projections are peer-reviewed and replicable. The historical record of major typhoon impacts on Guam and the CNMI is not a short list. The energetics that produce a Sinlaku exist because the ocean the storm crossed was warmer than the historical average, and the ocean is warmer than the historical average because the 44-year trend is real. What Sinlaku demonstrated is not an exception. It is a demonstration of what the system produces at its current thermal state. The fuel supply is not diminishing. The storm track corridor has not shifted away from the Marianas. The island chain is where it has always been, 13 to 18 degrees north, directly in the path. The next storm that reaches Category 5 intensity in the Philippine Sea will have access to the same thermal reservoir that Sinlaku used. The one after that will have access to a reservoir that is, by the trend line, fractionally warmer still. There is no mechanism in the current trajectory that reverses that. There is no sign the curve is flattening. The system is not moving toward equilibrium. It is moving in the other direction, and Guam and the CNMI are sitting precisely where the data says the most intense output of that system has always gone. Part 8. What FEMA's own response timeline reveals about the prioritization gap. There is a metric that FEMA does not publish as a single ranked table, but the data exists, and when you pull it from the agency's own disaster declaration archive and lay the timelines side by side, the pattern is not subtle. For major continental US storms that make landfall in states with full congressional representation, with governors who hold press conferences, with senators who appear on Sunday morning programs demanding federal action, FEMA major disaster declarations have historically been issued within 24 to 72 hours of landfall, sometimes faster. After Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas in August 2017, President Trump signed a major disaster declaration within 2 days. After Hurricane Irma struck Florida in September 2017, a declaration came through in roughly the same window. After Hurricane Ian hit Florida's southwest coast in September 2022, the declaration arrived in under 24 hours. The machinery moves when the machinery is being watched. The machinery is not always being watched. When Super Typhoon Sinlaku struck Saipan on August 31, 2024, with 150 miles per hour sustained winds and gusts, reaching 184 miles per hour, the federal disaster response process did not come with a press conference visible in national news feeds. There was no FEMA administrator standing at a podium in front of agency signage on CNN. There was no Sunday program segment in which a cabinet official walked through damage assessments and committed to a recovery timeline. The process unfolded. Resources moved on some level through the existing channels. But the public accountability layer, the layer that creates political cost for inaction and political reward for speed, was effectively absent. And the absence of that layer is not a coincidence. It is the predictable output of a system in which the people most directly harmed cannot vote on the legislation that governs the system. To understand why that matters, you have to look at 2018. Because 2018 is where the Government Accountability Office built the documented record. In October 2018, Typhoon Yutu made landfall in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. At the time of landfall, Yutu carried sustained winds of approximately 180 miles per hour, making it the strongest typhoon ever to strike US soil at that point in the historical record. This was not a marginal event. This was a Category 5 at full force, crossing directly over Saipan and Tinian, destroying thousands of structures, leaving residents without power for weeks, and severing the supply chains that keep those islands functional. And when the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, the independent, nonpartisan federal watchdog agency that reports to Congress, later reviewed the federal response to Yutu, it documented delays and coordination gaps that, in the agency's measured bureaucratic language, represented significant deficiencies in the timeliness and effectiveness of the response. Let me be specific about what that means in practice, because significant deficiencies is the kind of phrase that gets absorbed and forgotten. The CNMI's power grid, already operating on aging and fragile infrastructure, sustained catastrophic damage in Yutu. Grid restoration timelines in the CNMI following that storm stretched well beyond what comparable damage in a continental US state would have produced, in part because the logistical pipeline for equipment, crews, and materials is fundamentally different when the affected area sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There are no adjacent states to draw crews from. There is no highway for a convoy of utility trucks. Everything moves by air or by sea, and when the storm has damaged the port and the air facilities, the window for getting resources in compresses even further. The GAO's review found that coordination between federal agencies, territorial authorities, and private utilities was slower than it should have been, and that the frameworks for prepositioning resources before a major storm in the Pacific Territories lagged behind comparable frameworks for continental US operations. The GAO published its findings. They are in the public record. Congress received them. And the structural conditions that produced those findings The underfunded grid, the narrow logistics pipeline, the political accountability gap, remained largely in place when Sinlaku arrived 6 years later. That 6-year gap between Yutu and Sinlaku is not an era of reform. The power infrastructure in the CNMI runs at a grid-hardening investment level, that is, on a per capita basis, roughly 1/3 of the comparable figure for Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico's grid has itself been a subject of sustained national criticism since Hurricane Maria hit in 2017. If the Puerto Rico standard is the floor of what inadequate looks like, the CNMI baseline sits below that floor. That is not a framing choice. That is the infrastructure funding record. The political mechanics of why this gap persists are not complicated. They are just uncomfortable to state directly. The CNMI has a resident representative in the US House of Representatives. Guam has a delegate to the US House of Representatives. Neither of those representatives can cast a vote on the House floor on final passage of legislation. They can serve on committees. They can participate in debate. They can introduce bills and advocate for their constituents in every procedural form available to them. But when the roll call happens, when the vote that actually allocates the money, sets the policy, or mandates the agency response is recorded, their names are not on the board. They do not count toward the majority. They cannot be the deciding vote on anything. This is not a grievance. This is a constitutional and statutory fact that has direct, measurable consequences for how federal resources are prioritized, because political prioritization follows political accountability, and political accountability follows voting power. A senator from Florida who faces re-election in 2 years has a structural incentive to ensure that FEMA moves fast after a storm hits Miami. The incentive is built into the system. The constituent pressure is real, and it carries electoral weight. A resident representative from the CNMI who cannot vote on the floor does not carry the same weight in the internal negotiations that determine how quickly a disaster declaration gets signed, how much pre-positioned resources are in place before a storm, and how loudly the federal response is publicized after landfall. The incentive structure is not the same, and when the incentive structure is not the same, the outcomes are not the same. This has been true for 3 decades, not 3 years, 3 decades. Typhoon Omar hit Guam in 1992 with 150 miles per hour sustained winds. The national coverage was minimal. The federal response unfolded without the visibility that accompanies major continental US disasters. Typhoon Paka hit Guam in 1997, with gusts recorded at 236 miles per hour at Andersen Air Force Base, a number that still sits in the global surface wind measurement record, and the national news cycle moved on in under 48 hours, with no lasting political accountability mechanism triggered. Typhoon Yutu hit the CNMI in 2018, earned its place as the strongest typhoon ever to strike US soil, and produced a GAO report documenting response failures that, had they occurred after a storm in Louisiana or the Carolinas, would have generated congressional hearings, network special reports, and midterm election consequences. None of those things happened. The GAO report entered the archive. The structural conditions stayed in place. And here is what the response timeline data reveals when you look at it honestly. Speed is a function of pressure, and pressure is a function of visibility. And visibility is a function of who is watching, and whether what they see has consequences for people in power. When 170,000 Americans in the continental United States are watching a storm unfold in real time on national television, and those Americans can vote in Senate races in Florida and Texas and North Carolina, the FEMA administrator has a reason to be at the podium within 48 hours. When 170,000 Americans in the Marianas are watching a storm make landfall in near-total national media silence, And those Americans are represented in Congress by delegates who cannot vote. The pressure architecture is different. Not absent, different.